Sign the medical release waiver, Elena, and stop staring at your diagnostic charts like a sullen private. It is just a routine asset restructuring, and your sister's fifth wellness oasis cannot wait for the Military Pension Bureau to clear your back pay. Those were the first words my mother said to me while I was sitting in the outpatient rehabilitation clinic of the Walter Reed Military Medical Center. Not, how is your hearing recovering after the blast in Eastern Europe? Not, are the inner ear implants managing to damp down the permanent ringing? Not even, it is good to have you back on American soil after 18 months of managing cyber networks in active combat zones. Just paper. Before I could answer, the black and black bone conduction hearing aid clipped behind my left ear let out a sharp, high-pitched metallic ring. A heavy, low-frequency indicator of an incoming audio distortion. I didn't reach up to adjust it. I let the metallic frequency hum against my jawbone, filtering out the artificial strain in her voice. My mother didn't look at the device. She didn't look at my stiff, olive-drab civilian utility jacket that still smelled of high-altitude transport fuel. She only looked at the gold-plated Mont Blanc pen she held out toward me like a weapon. My mother, Elena Vance, did not do medical facility waiting rooms well. The sterile smell of floor bleach and isopropyl alcohol offended her specific scent profile, which consisted strictly of expensive French lavender and old Connecticut real estate money. The corporate underwriters for the Aspen expansion meet at 5 o'clock, she added, her eyes flashing down to her diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. If the family wealth statement isn't notarized before the market closes, they will pass the primary investment slot to the Schuyler family. And I am certainly not going to let this family lose prestige because you want to spend your afternoon analyzing disability assessment metrics. Then, when she realized my hand wasn't moving from my lap to take her pen, she set it down on my medical clipboard with a sharp, metallic click. The sound was small, flat, and definitive in the white room. She turned on her designer leather heels, her cream-colored silk trench coat swirling against the metal doorframe, and walked out without looking back once. I watched her disappear into the busy corridor, passing a young corporal who was navigating a wheelchair with his remaining arm. She didn't see him either. People like Elena Vance do not see anything that cannot be converted into social currency. For exactly 60 seconds, I remained perfectly still, not because the exclusion caused me personal injury. When you spend 24 years in the United States Cyber Command, tracking digital warfare threats and tracing how hostile non-state actors launder operational funds through shell entities, your nerve endings stop registering domestic insults. Hurt is a luxury for people who have never had to run an encryption audit while mortar fire shatters the perimeter wall. My response wasn't emotional. It was diagnostic. The bone conduction aid clicked again, returning to its quiet baseline. I picked up the paper she had left on my clipboard. It was a standard general power of attorney waiver, designed to give her sole, unrestricted management over my domestic federal accounts while I adjusted to civilian life. I didn't sign it. Instead, I pulled my secure defense-encrypted mobile device from my pocket, inserted my multi-factor authentication card, and logged into my military credit union portal. The screen loaded slowly under the thick concrete shielding of the hospital basement. When the numbers finally refreshed on the clean, gray interface, my pulse didn't skip a beat. My chest remained perfectly flat, my breathing entirely uniform. The main account balance read exactly $0.00. This was my federal combat savings account, the restricted, tax-exempt repository where the military had deposited my operational hazardous duty pay, my combat bonuses, and my early medical retirement compensation for 24 years of service. The capital meant to secure a quiet life for my injured frame, and my daughter's upcoming university fees was gone. All $184,500 of it. I set the phone down on the stainless steel instrument tray beside my chair. The metal made a brief, rattling vibration against the frame. But to understand how I reached this white room, and how my own blood came to believe that 24 years of my physical health was nothing more than an open credit line for their social vanity, I need to look at the first entry in the tracking ledger. My name is Elena Vance. I am 52 years old, and until 45 days ago, I held the rank of Master Sergeant within the United States Cyber Command, specializing in digital forensics, system penetration analysis, and federal wire fraud tracking. My current existence is entirely modest by deliberate choice. I live in a single-story rented cottage near the naval station in Great Lakes, Illinois, within walking distance of the cold water. I drive a 7-year-old diesel truck with a faded tailgate. I do not own silk dresses. I do not attend weekend wellness retreats. My entire professional identity is stored in secure federal data registries that 99% of the civilian population will never have the clearance parameters to read. 24 years in the network warfare community changes how your eyes process documentation. When you spend your life hunting white-collar predators who manipulate digital financial networks, people who forge procurement codes or alter weapon system component certifications, you become entirely immune to the theater of domestic wealth. My physical body carries the permanent price of that career. The inner ear blast injury from an artillery strike near the Black Sea has left me with an 80% hearing deficiency in the left canal. On damp, low-pressure mornings, the bone clicks with a heavy, metallic ring that serves as an internal reminder of what true national service actually costs. But while my hearing requires artificial modification, my analytical mind remains perfectly clear. My training taught me a fundamental law of accounting. Greed makes people stupid. When a con artist believes they are the most sophisticated actor in the room, they stop checking their digital exhaust. They commit their infractions in the open because they assume the people around them are too unsophisticated, too intimidated, or too desperate for familial approval to ask for the transaction numbers. They look at a woman with a faded utility jacket and a gray plastic device behind her ear, and they see an invisible government technician. They do not realize that some of us spent our careers hunting people who launder millions of dollars through global banking systems for breakfast. When I carried my canvas bag out of the Walter Reed Clinic that afternoon, I didn't send an angry text message to my mother. I didn't call my younger sister, Beatrice, to demand an explanation for the sudden expansion of her luxury wellness sanctuaries. I simply drove my truck to my rented cottage, laid my government-issued, hardened Panasonic Toughbook laptop across the old kitchen table, and opened a clean, secure command terminal. I didn't react. I opened a spreadsheet. I knew my mother believed my long deployment cycles had left me blind to her private financial maneuvers. She thought that because I didn't participate in her frantic, status-chasing dinner table arguments about country club memberships and real estate portfolios, I was just a compliance mechanism, a reliable, quiet daughter who would allow her service record to be used as a rubber stamp for the family's commercial vanity. She had miscalculated the nature of my silence. In my line of work, when a senior forensic auditor goes quiet, it doesn't mean they've stopped tracking the numbers. It means they've just opened the official evidentiary file. The Vance presence in Greenwich, Connecticut, was maintained entirely through a carefully curated illusion of permanent wealth. My father had left a modest real estate portfolio when he passed away in 2019, but my mother refused to alter her lifestyle to match the reality of a changing market. She treated the family name like a permanent credit card with no spending limit, using her social prestige to draw private investments into her younger daughter's business ventures. My sister Beatrice was everything my mother wanted: performance-driven, smooth-talking, and deeply embedded in the luxury consumer market. When Beatrice launched Aura Yoga LLC in 2022, she didn't use her own capital. She used my mother's social connections to secure loans. But by early 2022, the high-end fitness market in New England had become oversaturated. The luxury studios were losing $12,000 a week in overhead, and the banks were refusing to extend their corporate credit lines without a high-net-worth guarantor. The first financial shift occurred in March of 2024, while I was stationed at a secure facility in Stuttgart, Germany, tracking network anomalies. I noticed a withdrawal from my secondary federal allotments ledger, $14,500. A transaction memo listed it as healthcare maintenance, family care allocation. 3 days later, Beatrice posted a series of marketing photos showing the installation of an imported Italian marble water feature at her flagship Greenwich Oasis. When I contacted my mother via a secure line to ask about the withdrawal, her voice instantly dropped into that tone of cold, patronizing superiority she reserved for government employees. "Elena, please." She had sighed, her voice thin over the static of the connection. The family trust required an administrative rebalancing to ensure the property tax profile remained secure. If the family credit score drops because your government salary is sitting idle in a non-interest military account, it damages your sister's commercial expansion. Do not become small-minded just because you live in a government-subsidized barracks. I said nothing. I was counting. The second wave arrived in November of 2025. I was undergoing treatment for my hearing impairment at a military base in Virginia when I received an automated alert from the credit union regarding a commercial wire transfer application. The amount was exactly $100,000. The destination listed was Vance Asset Reinvestment Group, a shell corporation registered to my mother's home address. The signature on the authorization line was an unrendered digital scan of my name, the exact signature image that was stored on the old family power of attorney files from my first deployment in 2008. I called my sister Beatrice directly. She answered from her car, the engine of her brand new Mercedes humming softly in the background. "Elena, it's just a temporary bridge loan. For heaven's sake," she laughed, her tone completely smooth and free of panic. The corporate underwriters in Aspen needed to see $100,000 in liquid earnest money to clear the lease for our 5th location. "Mom said you wouldn't mind. You're overseas half the time anyway, and you don't have any real commercial overhead. It's a family asset, Elena. We are using the resources where they generate the highest visibility." The subtext was clear. In their world, my 24 years of hazardous duty pay wasn't a sacred resource for an injured veteran's retirement. It was an unexploited credit reserve. A clean, silent fund they could bleed dry to buy marble water features and luxury cars to maintain their status at the country club. They looked at my refusal to engage in domestic shouting matches, and they assumed I was predictable. They thought that because I was a quiet soldier, I would always step back to let Beatrice shine brighter. I let them spend. Every unauthorized transfer path they carved through my military network wasn't a victory. It was just another heavy anchor locking them tighter into the federal criminal jurisdiction. By June of 2026, the total amount extracted through these unauthorized digital transfers had reached exactly $114,500. Every date logged, every transfer path mapped. And then, while I was on a medical evacuation flight over the Atlantic, they executed the third wave, the final withdrawal that cleared out the remaining $70,000 of my active combat savings, leaving the balance at absolute zero. Have you ever been treated like the dependable family member everyone counts on, right up until the moment you needed help yourself? Have you ever sacrificed years of your life for people who only loved what you could give them? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe respect should never come with a receipt, subscribe to the channel. The clock on the wall of my kitchen read exactly 2:47 a.m. when I found the system transaction log. The house was completely silent, save for the low, monotonous hum of the commercial shipping harbor, 400 yards down the road. The only illumination in the small room came from the harsh, clinical blue glare of my Toughbook screen, reflecting off the cold, half-empty cup of black coffee sitting on the edge of the laminate table. I didn't move my hands from the keyboard for 4 minutes. My eyes were locked on a line of system metadata that had bypassed my regular personal notification parameters. The final transaction for $70,000 had taken place on April 14th, while I was unconscious in an emergency stabilization theater at a field clinic in Ramstein, Germany. The withdrawal hadn't been initiated through a bank branch. It had been executed via an online merchant portal, registered to Aura Yoga LLC. The authorization method listed was an encrypted digital signature certificate that had been issued through a remote online notary service based in Delaware. I zoomed in on the notary transaction packet, processing the digital file frame by frame with a dual-pass forensic filter. Julian Sterling, my mother's estate attorney, had utilized a remote online notary portal into the Defense Credit Union server on a quiet Sunday night, assuming no manual compliance officer would check the logs. He was unaware that the federal database applies an automatic tracking flag to all off-hours access from residential IP clusters. He had simply uploaded a low-resolution scan of my old civilian driver's license from 2012. The timestamp on the notary file matched a morning when my medical charts confirmed my blood pressure was being monitored by 3 military surgeons. Counting. Not anger. Not revenge. Counting. I closed the browser tab containing the military credit union portal. I opened a fresh, local encrypted repository on my solid-state drive. I named it something plain and entirely nondescript. Vance Asset Review 2026.dat. I began importing the raw system logs, the cryptographic hash failures, the hospital admission timestamps, and the network routing history from the Delaware notary server. My mother had spent her life operating on the assumption that if a financial document looked professional, and if it was backed by an old family name and a high-priced corporate lawyer, the truth beneath the paper became irrelevant. She had absolutely no concept of network forensics. She didn't know what an IP address was. She didn't understand that, when her attorney executed that transfer from his office on Greenwich Avenue at 10:14 a.m., his corporate router left a unique, permanent digital fingerprint on the federal banking server, a fingerprint that directly matched her personal iMac computer's MAC address. I copied the final data verification file into the secure repository, clicked the master encryption protocol, and watched the progress bar hit 100%. Then I shut down the laptop lid with a soft, clean click. The space was perfectly quiet. The ledger was complete. Now, it was just a matter of selecting the correct operational environment to display the balance. The following 5 days required absolute tactical discipline. I maintained my quiet routine at the Great Lakes Cottage, completing my terminal retirement physical therapy while building the evidence package in parallel with normal life. I didn't engage in phone calls with my family. When Beatrice sent a digital invitation showing the architectural renderings for her 5th wellness location, complete with an indoor mineral pool that looked suspiciously like it cost exactly $184,500, I didn't reply. I let them spend. I was building a file. On Thursday afternoon, I drove to the Federal Metropolitan Enforcement Center in Chicago to meet with a trusted expert, a senior forensic investigator with the Defense Contract Audit Agency named Marcus Vance. We sat in a small, windowless review room that smelled of old floor wax and stale plastic. I pushed a heavy, steel-gray plastic-bound binder across the stainless steel table toward him. It contained exactly 212 pages of printed federal bank records, cryptographic system logs, and notarized affidavits from my military medical charts in Germany. It weighed exactly 4.5 pounds. Marcus didn't speak for 15 minutes. He turned the pages frame by frame, his reading glasses catching the harsh white glare of the ceiling lights. He stopped on page 74, tracing his finger along the routing history of the $100,000 transfer from my combat savings account. When he finally looked up, his face was completely smooth, devoid of any personal warmth. "Elena, this isn't an estate dispute between relatives. This is an active, aggressive federal wire fraud scheme, targeting a restricted military compensation account. They didn't just take domestic capital. They intercepted a protected federal asset using counterfeit digital credentials on a military network. That triggers Title 18, United States Code, Section 134.3, Wire Fraud, and Section 1028, Aggravated Identity Theft. The fact that the victim is a registered veteran under an active medical evaluation profile means the Office of the Inspector General will take jurisdiction within an hour of filing." "I know," I said, my voice entirely authoritative, carrying the cold precision of a senior auditor. The metadata analysis on page 112 confirms the systemic origin of the forgery. Every online authorization request came from the corporate network assigned to Julian Sterling's office. Marcus closed the binder with a sharp, heavy thump against the metal table. "Your sister's flagship grand opening and investor gala is tomorrow night at the Greenwich Conservatory, correct? Your mother is scheduled to sign the final venture capital expansion papers before the primary lenders. Yes, I replied, my voice steady, flat, and entirely composed. My mother is providing the family asset affidavit as the primary security for the expansion loan. She believes she is securing her position as the chief trustee of the region's largest wellness infrastructure. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out an encrypted mobile communication terminal. The regional U.S. attorney will issue the emergency seizure warrants before the event begins. I will coordinate with the local federal marshals. Do you want this processed quietly at the corporate headquarters? No, I said quietly. The fraud was built on public presentation, Marcus. It should be closed before the exact audience they used to validate the lie. The Grand Hall of the Greenwich Conservatory was a masterpiece of pure commercial presentation. The ceiling was a massive glass vault, throwing sharp reflections from the crystal lanterns across 400 guests, dressed in white silk and tailored linen. The air was a heavy mix of lavender incense, expensive champagne, and the low, continuous roar of wealthy people, confirming each other's status. At the front of the hall, a giant LED screen displayed the logo for Ara Yoga Global, surrounded by architectural blueprints of the new Aspen facility. I stood against the stone pillars near the service entrance at the rear of the room. In strict compliance with the 3-page email my sister Beatrice had sent me earlier that week, demanding that I avoid wearing any military uniforms or identifiers that might distract attention from the organic aesthetic of the luxury brand. I was wearing a simple, dark charcoal woolen coat, buttoned to the throat, with no ribbons, no medals, and no rank insignia. I had been instructed to hold my mother's spare silk shawl and stay clear of the primary investor circles. I remained quiet, holding the shawl, invisible. 40 feet ahead of me, Beatrice was the center of gravity for a large circle of venture capitalists. She was wearing a custom silk gown, her teeth flashing white under the lights as she pointed toward the digital displays behind her. My mother stood directly beside her, her chest expanded, her face flushed with the deep satisfaction of a woman who believed she had finally secured her family's permanent social legacy. The capital modernization parameters are fully locked, Beatrice announced to the crowd, her voice projecting with effortless, theatrical confidence. Our liquidity profile has passed the underwriting review. This Aspen expansion is the final operational component required to clear the national franchise advance. We are offering our private partners a preferred entry tier before the public launch next month. One elderly investor, Mr. Henderson, nodded approvingly, his pen hovering over a leather-bound signature booklet. The Liquidity Foundation is verified, Eleanor? Your corporate counsel confirmed the allocation numbers. My mother smiled warmly, waving a dismissive hand. Our financial profile is completely unassailable, Mr. Henderson. The funds are resting securely in our private wealth account. We maintain absolute structural continuity over the family assets. I stepped out from the shadow of the stone pillar. I didn't sprint. I walked down the center aisle of the conservatory, my left ear device humming softly with that steady metallic ring as I moved past the lines of white floral arrangements. The heavy gray plastic-bound binder was held securely in my right hand. My mother saw me when I was 15 feet from the presentation stage. Her posture instantly stiffened, her eyes turning into cold slits as she stepped forward to block my path. Elena, what are you doing here? She hissed, her voice dropping into a desperate, furious whisper. I told you to remain near the entrance. This is the final signing ceremony. Get back to the rear of the hall immediately. I didn't answer her. I walked past her as if she were a piece of the building's infrastructure, stepped directly to the center table where the investment contracts were laid out, and dropped the 4.5-pound binder directly over the leather signature booklets. The steel gray jacket didn't slide on the polished wood. Its weight, 4.5 pounds of continuous server logs, held it exactly where the truth demanded it to sit, making a sharp, definitive smack through the open microphone. The crowd around the table went completely still. The glasses stopped moving. Beatrice's smile didn't vanish, but it turned brittle, her eyes darting to the folder, then to my face. Elena, please. We are in the middle of a commercial closing. If you have an administrative question about your retirement paperwork, take it to the office on Monday." I didn't look at her. I pulled my secure terminal interface device from my pocket, connected it to the hall's local media hub, and executed the master system override command. The giant LED screens behind the stage went completely black for 4 seconds, the architectural blueprints vanishing instantly. The audience exchanged confused, quiet glances. Then the screen loaded a single, massive federal document. The Certified Wire Transfer Intercept Ledger from the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. The shortest sentence in the entire script landed in the absolute silence of the room. Page 74. Your signature, April 14th. The conservatory grew completely quiet. Every eye turned to the display. The image on the screen was a 5-foot-tall rendering of the counterfeit online transfer request, completely defaced by a massive, bright red federal audit watermark that ran diagonally from corner to corner. Federal wire fraud investigation status. Account intercepted by a cybercom. My mother's face lost every ounce of its color, in a single, physical second. Her hand went to the edge of the table, her fingers slipping against the wood as her breathing became short and shallow. The theatrical performance had completely evaporated, leaving nothing but the terrified, hollow look of a con artist who had just watched her paper empire catch fire. The next page loaded automatically, a line-by-line financial wall detailing every single transfer from my combat savings account directly into the corporate checking account of Aura Yoga LLC. March 14th, 2024, $14,500. November 18th, 2025, $100,000. April 14th, 2020 $70,000. Total confirmed diversion, $184,500. A sharp, sudden wave of whispers erupted at the front of the room and raced toward the back. Mr. Henderson dropped his gold pen onto the table, his expression turning into one of profound, cold fury, as he pulled his signature booklet away from Beatrice's folder. My mother looked at the screen, then at Beatrice, then back at the screen, her mouth opening slightly, as her hands began to shake against her sides. For the first time in her life, Elena Vance appeared completely, utterly lost. The private security office behind the Grand Conservatory was small, utilitarian, and smelled of cold industrial floor wax and stale plastic. It was a space designed for holding disruptive guests, a profound contrast to the glass-vaulted luxury of the hall we had just left. My mother sat on a low vinyl bench, her hands resting on her knees, her head bowed so low that the perfect sculpt of her silver hair looked exposed under the raw fluorescent tubes. Beatrice sat in a metal chair across from her, her custom silk gown wrinkled, her eyes fixed blankly on the gray linoleum floor. Special Agent Marcus Vance stood near the exit door, 2 local federal marshals standing quietly behind him with their hands resting on their utility belts. "You have destroyed this family, Elena," my mother said, her voice barely a whisper, completely stripped of that executive authority she had used to demand my compliance 4 days ago. "You took your sister's future, and you displayed it like a circus exhibit, in front of every financial partner I have spent 40 years building relationships with. If there was an administrative error in the filing, we could have resolved it quietly. You didn't have to humiliate us." "It wasn't an administrative error, Mother," I said, my voice dead calm, carrying the heavy, unchanging weight of a military investigator who had spent her life reading back numbers to people who thought they would never be counted. It was federal bank fraud. It was a calculated, criminal forgery designed to use my 24 years of active combat pay as a shield to secure a luxury expansion loan for a lifestyle Beatrice didn't earn. You knew the credentials were fake when you signed the wealth affidavit, Mother. You just didn't care because the presentation looked important enough to buy you the status you wanted. Beatrice didn't look up. He rubbed his left thumb against his palm, a nervous, repeating tell that showed the performance was truly over. My mother lifted her head, her eyes red and wet under the clinical white lights. "You have always been so bitter, Elena. You never could stand to see your sister succeed. You have your pension, your government security. You have everything. Beatrice needed this capital to become something. You have ruined our name. Our name didn't have integrity, mother, I replied, my voice completely smooth, devoid of anger or triumph. It just had a paint job. I reached for the heavy plastic buttons of the dark charcoal woolen coat my mother had ordered me to wear to hide my identity. One button, then another, then another. I pulled the heavy wool away and laid the coat across the back of the security officer's desk. Beneath it sat my white dress uniform, pristine, pressed, and structurally perfect. The gold shoulder boards of a senior master sergeant reflected the harsh fluorescent tubes of the ceiling grid. The dense rows of ribbons crossed my left breast, a 24-year record of silent, documented sacrifice in environments where my mother and sister wouldn't have survived 48 hours. And beneath the third row sat the commendation medal with an valor device, its metal clean and heavy against the white fabric. The room went completely, perfectly still. My mother froze, her eyes locked onto the medal, as if she were looking at an alien artifact. Beatrice's shoulders tightened, her breathing stopping for 3 full seconds. They weren't looking at the invisible technician who carried briefcases anymore. They were looking at the officer whose network protocols had cleared compliance pipelines across 3 continents. The officer whose honor they had tried to borrow to fund an Aspen lease. I am not your emergency fund anymore, mother, I said, delivering the liberation signal with absolute finality. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. I stopped doing all the work to preserve your illusions, and it turns out that was enough to let the truth do its job. Before either of them could formulate a response, Special Agent Marcus Vance stepped forward, pulling 2 sets of standard steel federal handcuffs from his case. The marshals moved in behind him. Eleanor Vance, Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit aggravated identity theft under Title 18 of the United States Code. Please step forward and place your hands behind your back. The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't involve a dramatic speech or an explosion of hot temper. It was just the clean, metallic clicking of steel rings closing over tailored cuffs, and the low rustle of silk coats being adjusted as they were led out the side corridor toward the federal transport vehicles waiting in the rain. 6 months later, I stood on the wooden pier overlooking the Severn River just after sunrise. The morning air was sharp and cold, smelling of diesel fuel, wet cedar, and the deep, clean salt of the low tide moving through Annapolis Harbor. The water moved below the piers, a massive gray mass, completely unbothered by the dynamic of the shore. It did not need to scream or announce its density to the world. It simply carried its weight. A group of young naval cadets walked past the training center entrance, their boots hitting the wood in a loose, rhythmic cadence as they carried their logistics manuals toward the morning lecture hall. One of them waved to me as they passed. I nodded back, a simple, quiet acknowledgement between people who understand that a ledger is something you protect with your life, not something you wear as a costume. I reached into the inner pocket of my utility jacket and pulled out a simple, matte black government-issue plastic ballpoint pen, the standard 3-cent utility tool I had used to log system errors for 2 decades. I used it to sign a routine hardware clearance report on my clipboard, then slid it back into my pocket. The gesture was small, ordinary. It carried no gold plating, no country club registry, and no false authorization. It was just an honest mark on a real asset, a circle completed on my own terms. My terminal phone sat inside my jacket pocket, entirely silent. For the first time since I had returned to American soil, my stomach didn't tighten when the screen illuminated. There were no more urgent, demanding group messages from Greenwich about corporate underwritings, no more frantic legal documents from my mother's attorneys demanding my compliance signature, no more internal calculations running through my head during the hours after midnight. The weight was completely gone. Not the memory of the betrayal, but the pressure of the role I had allowed myself to carry for 30 years. The role of the quiet, dependable daughter who would absorb the damage to keep the family looking successful. The Greenwich estate and the flagship wellness facility had been liquidated 3 months ago under a federal asset forfeiture order to satisfy the restitution demands of the regional banking pool and the private equity investors Beatrice had deceived. My mother accepted a plea agreement in federal court last month. 36 months at a low-security correctional facility in West Virginia. Julian Sterling received 6 years and a permanent revocation of his license to practice law. Beatrice is currently living in a small apartment outside Hartford, working as a retail assistant, the exact kind of ordinary, unglamorous existence she had spent her life committing ethical compromises to avoid. Prestige is a remarkably fragile thing. Everyone wants to stand near its warmth when the lights are bright, but nobody wants to be found within miles of the wreckage when the ledger finally calls for the true balance. My mother lives now in a structured, state-monitored environment, with 3 roommates and a strict daily schedule, the exact reality she looked down upon for decades. Aura Yoga Global went offline permanently on a Tuesday afternoon. By Friday, her investment partners were already pretending they had never heard the family name. Maybe you are the reliable one in your own circle. Maybe you are the responsible one, the person everyone counts on to maintain the family's structural integrity, while everyone else plays at success. There is no shame in being that person. The world functions because quiet, orderly people show up to do the work every single day. The destruction begins when your value in that circle becomes entirely dependent on your willingness to let them exploit your credibility for their comfort. Helping a relative through a period of genuine, unforeseen misfortune is an act of love. Funding somebody's endless, arrogant vanity because they refuse to operate within the parameters of reality is enabling. Those two things are not the same, and they never will be. The people who benefit the most from your lack of boundaries will always be the loudest, most vicious critics when you finally decide to build them. They will call you bitter. They will tell you that you are destroying the family name because you are jealous of their potential. They use those words because guilt is the only leverage they have left to force your signature. You are allowed to create boundaries even with your family, especially with your family. You are not a compliance tool for people who do not respect your honor. You are not required to make your own career, your own name, or your own retirement smaller, just so that your relatives can pretend to be bigger than they are. Never sign a document you cannot survive losing, and never let anyone tell you that blood requires you to co-sign a felony. I spent 24 years in the service protecting the network borders of my country's infrastructure. But somewhere along that journey, I forgot to build a secure perimeter around my own soul. I believed that stepping back and remaining silent was the price of keeping domestic peace. I was wrong. Silence in the face of fraud isn't strategy, it is complicity. And human dignity is something you can never afford to negotiate, because once you stay silent just to preserve harmony, you are simply feeding the arrogance of people who have started treating your sacrifice as their permanent entitlement. I turned away from the river, slipped my hands into my pockets, and began my walk toward the training center, where a new class of cadets was waiting for their morning instruction. My step was clean, my posture straight, the white dress jacket carrying the weight of my own actions and nothing else. I wasn't carrying my mother's shawls anymore. I wasn't carrying her illusions. I was just Elena Vance, walking forward into a quiet, ordinary morning, carrying nothing at all. If this story meant something to you today, and if you needed a reminder that your honor cannot be borrowed by people who haven't earned it, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need this exact reminder in their life right now.